Hello and welcome to Decision NYC with Ben Max. I'm Ben Max, your host and the executive editor of Gotham Gazette. The 2021 New York City election cycle is well underway and it's poised to be the most significant municipal election in decades. All of city government is on the ballot, and because so few incumbents are eligible to run for re-election due to term limits, New Yorkers are electing many new office holders this year and the next roster of leadership for the city to take over in January of 2022. There will be a new mayor of New York City elected here in 2021, as well as a new city controller, several new borough presidents, and many new city council members. And that's not all that's on the ballot. Several incumbents are eligible for and seeking re-election, including the city's public advocate. And there's a very crowded and competitive race for Manhattan District Attorney and still more. Party primaries are set for June, and the general election in the fall will culminate on November 2nd. This is the first full set of municipal elections that will feature both early voting and the new ranked choice voting system. Ranked choice voting applies to only party primaries and special elections, and we'll have a separate show just on ranked choice voting. This city election cycle would be of enormous importance under more usual circumstances, but it's unfolding at a time of great crisis for our city, raising the stakes of the decisions that you, the voter, will make. The next wave of city leadership will quite clearly make or break the city's recovery from the devastation of the COVID-19 pandemic and its many impacts on health, families, jobs, education, housing, and much, much more. It's also important to note that the city faced a number of crises even before the pandemic, and several of those have only worsened since. So it's an important time of choosing here in New York City, and we're pleased to bring you this series of interviews with the candidates for citywide offices, mayor, controller, public advocate, as well as borough-wide positions like borough president and district attorney. And there will be debates, including for city council seats. But these one-on-one conversations help you get to know the candidates better, learn about their backgrounds and their platforms, where they stand on some key issues, and their vision for the future of the city. We hope this and other interviews will help you sort through your many choices and make informed decisions when it's time to vote. So today's interview, joining me now by Zoom, is Sara Tirschwell, a Republican candidate for New York City mayor. Sara, thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks, Ben. Hi.
Hi. So you're running for mayor. We'll get into your vision for the city, your campaign platform in a couple minutes. But first, tell folks a little bit about your background and give us a couple minutes on your resume, where you come from, who you are.
Okay. Well, Ben, I came here as a young woman to New York City, seeking opportunity after what I would say was a childhood full of loss. And I think you know that I've overcome many challenges, and that includes many situations where I stood up and spoke truth to power, and in doing so, created a set of new challenges for myself. And my entire career has been spent focusing on complex situations in crisis as a fiduciary for other people's money. And that strikes me as exactly what the job description is for the next mayor of New York City. As you know, the finances of New York City are a mess and need to be cleaned up. And that's what I can do. And that's what I've been doing my entire career.
Say more about that career. Where have you spent the bulk of your time? What kinds of specific tasks and responsibilities have you had?
So I started my career working at a firm called R.D. Smith, which does not exist anymore, but was a distressed research, trading, and investment firm. And so I worked on, for instance, the bankruptcies of Drexel, Burnham Lambert, which was probably the biggest bankruptcy before Lehman Brothers in the financial crisis. I ended up spending about half my career at a firm called Davidson Kempner Capital Management, where I had portfolio management duties. I invested in plenty of fairly complex, troubled situations. And since that period of time, I've been acting as a consultant and restructuring advisor, interim management, conducting both balance sheet restructurings and operational turnarounds for a number of different types of companies.
What are the key skills and characteristics to this work? What should people know are your top assets when it comes to skills or characteristics that are sort of transferable to different lines of work? You're making the pitch, obviously, that you want to come from the private sector to city government to lead the city. What are those skills and characteristics that you have that you think should most appeal to voters as someone for the next mayor of New York City?
Well, okay, so distress finance basically requires that you be, kind of part investigative reporter, part lawyer, part judge, part coalition builder. Basically, what you have to do is you have to be able to look at really get into the weeds of both operational due diligence and balance sheet due diligence. So examining what are kind of the assets of a particular situation, the liabilities of a particular situation, and sometimes those can be financial assets, so sometimes they can be hard assets, sometimes they're the assets of the people, the management, the people on the ground who are conducting the operations of the company or the city, as is the case here. You have to figure out what are the kind of hidden assets of a situation? What are the hidden liabilities? You have to examine contracts. You have to understand legalese. I mean, it is probably the one discipline on Wall Street that requires the deepest set of skills in analyzing financials, I would say.
And so you would take that skill set and lead the city. Talk about the vision for what kind of leadership that would look like. How are you thinking about sort of the role of CEO of the city?
Well, so you can't look at any of these financial aspects of a city without some modicum of compassion. And you also have to figure out what are kind of the root problems that are causing the distress, right? So what are the root problems that are causing distress in New York City? And when I think about that, I think about what I've seen. I've lived here for almost 32 years. And what I've seen throughout my 32 years is that the very same thing that is causing people now to leave New York City is also the same thing that drives inequality in our city. And that is that we have both an oppressive regulatory regime, and I believe that we also are not, we have disparate delivery of critical services like education. And those are kind of the fundamental problems. So when I hear people talk about things like affordable housing, right? Why don't we have affordable housing in New York City? Most other large cities manage to have affordable housing. We don't have affordable housing, in my opinion, because of government intervention. We have, on one end, we decide that we're going to give tax abatements to developers to create luxury housing. And on the other end, we create this labyrinthian permitting, zoning, approval process to build housing. And then we have rent regulations that basically destroy the profit-making motive for landlords. And so I think we have to rethink all of those things and think about what is the role of government, and should government, in the instance of something like affordable housing, just basically get out of the way and let the market work, because we haven't done that.
Mhm.
It's like we're afraid to do that. It's like we're control freaks. We want to control the outcome. And I don't think we can control outcomes. I think what we can control is opportunity. And I think we need to focus on controlling opportunity.
since you brought up housing, let's stick with that for a second, and then maybe come back to the sort of vision for leadership of the city. But on housing, when you say sort of let the market go and get out of its way a bit, does that include trying to utilize some of the strategies around insisting that portions of certain developments are quote unquote affordable under certain income levels, that they people wouldn't have to pay more than 30% of their income on rent, those types of things? Or are you saying try to get rid of as much regulation like that as possible and really just sort of let the market do its thing?
I think we need to try to get rid of as much regulation as possible and let the free market determine, because the fact of the matter is that the way any market works is it's supply and demand, right? So if there's not enough demand for housing at a certain price point, housing prices will fall.
Well, couple things on that. Does that also include currently rent regulated apartments? Do you think they need to be brought out of regulation?
Well, the reason that they need to be brought out of regulation is multifold, and we could have a very long theoretical economic discussion as to why that is. But one of the biggest problems that I see with rent regulation is that, I know a lot of people who live in rent regulated apartments, and they complain because their landlords aren't fixing, I don't know, the broken floorboards,
Mhm.
the ceiling that's cratering above them, the bathtub that leaks, the oven that is 30 years old and works sporadically. But landlords have no incentive to fix those things because, again, we've removed the profit making incentive for them by dictating to them exactly how much money they can make.
And okay, so figure out a process for deregulating the currently regulated housing stock. I think part of the conversation around affordable housing and subsidies and incentives and rent regulation is that New York City has so much of this sort of dumbbell situation where there's so many very wealthy people and there's so many people living in poverty, and obviously there's many people in between. It's a very big city, but there's so many people living in poverty who really struggle to make the rent. Do you think that the market would really build enough deeply affordable housing and create enough deeply affordable housing if you sort of took the reins off, encouraged more development? I mean, I would think this would also necessitate really pushing zoning changes to
Yes.
encourage a lot of development.
Yes.
Mm.
So that's the thing. If we have a limited housing stock, right? A limited ability to build, then no, it won't work. Right? You have to sort of lift. I mean, I came here from Houston, and people joke about Houston because Houston basically has no zoning laws.
Mhm.
But Houston has a lot of affordable housing, right?
Mhm.
And maybe that is partially because, Houston is not an island, right? And it's kind of a sprawling metropolis, and New York City different um, has different geographical restrictions. But we need to lift a lot of zoning laws so that we encourage development and we encourage, again, the free market to take hold. But I also think that one of the other problems that you just talked about is the fact that this is a very divided city. And you called it a dumbbell. We have a lot of rich people and a lot of poor people. And we have to think about why that is. Why do we have an economy that doesn't seem to provide self-sufficiency for a whole swath of people in the middle? And why do people in the middle not want to live in New York City? Well, partially because public education is pretty bad in New York City, particularly in low-income minority neighborhoods. But also, we don't have an economy that allows for socioeconomic mobility. Why?
That's,
Why
that's that's right where I was going next. So yeah, talk about your vision for the economy. Go ahead.
why why are people in New York City, unlike many other cities in this country, why are they stuck in their socioeconomic lane? We have to ask ourselves about that. Why is that? Because that seems to me to be the crux of the problem. And if you ask me, that is because we have created a regulatory burden on people that prevents them from getting out of their socioeconomic lane. So, I'll give you a for instance. So if we're going to create a minimum wage, right? Let's say minimum wage we create a minimum wage, let's make it up, of $20 an hour, right?
Okay.
So a company like a big business like Amazon, which of course is not, unfortunately, in New York City with the 25,000
Well,
jobs.
not
The
with
company
not
that,
with the headquarters. Yeah.
yes, the headquarters, yes,
Still
that,
a presence, but
but yes, they still have a presence. But a large business like Amazon can afford to absorb a $20 minimum wage, and they will just pass on those costs to their consumers, right? The purchasers of their goods. Whereas a small business cannot afford that, because a small business has much more elastic demand,
mhm.
right? So so if they cannot pass on the price of their goods and services to their consumer, then they no longer are able to make a profit. And the other aspect is, so it not only raises kind of the break even or fixed costs of running a business, but it also creates a barrier to entry. So if you have to spend, let's say, I don't know, 25 or $50,000 to qualify for a license to run, I don't know, a nail salon. I don't actually understand why nail salons are so heavily regulated. That makes no sense to me, but anyway, we can talk about that another day. But let's say you have to spend 25 or $50,000 to get a license to operate a nail salon. Where are you going to get that 25 to $50,000? It's a job that requires fairly, unskilled labor. Although, I mean, I don't have that skill.
Right.
But do you see what I'm saying? As opposed to the normal costs of starting a business, which would basically be, can I afford the rent? Can I afford the deposit that I'm going to have to make on the rent? And can I afford the equipment that I'm going to need to start my nail salon? As opposed to this tangled web of licensing, and then you have enforcement for licenses. And I don't think that we properly think about the cost of enforcement. We think about the revenues that we get from fining people, but we don't think about the cost of driving businesses and entrepreneurial spirit out of the city.
So I'm hearing like on housing, on housing, on the economy, you want to pull back on government regulation, pull back on government presence, let the market really rule more.
Listen, I'm all for regulations that
Mhm.
promote a safer, kinder city, but at the same time, regulations that still manage to offer opportunity for all. And that means kind of taking down the obstacles to socioeconomic mobility, which we just talked about, which of course includes educating our school children. And that is part of educating our school children, is cultivating our own homegrown talent,
Mhm.
right? As well as attracting talent from all over the world. I think we've neglected cultivating our own homegrown talent. And that's a really important draw for businesses to want to be here.
Let me come back to that in just one second. I just want to follow up on something you said about the minimum wage, though. Can you just clarify what your stance on it is? Do you think there should be no minimum wage? Do you think you think it should be much more calibrated to the size of the business you maybe indicated, or what is your stance? What do you think the minimum wage picture should look like?
I don't think that there should be a minimum wage. I think what minimum wage does is it basically leaves people out of the workforce. I think that people should be free to decide for themselves what wage they're willing to work for. And I think that we have to, uh, you know, at a time of full employment, I see a reason for a minimum wage. At a time when, unemployment is, close to 20%, people should be allowed, again, people should be free to work for a wage that they're willing to work for.
Okay. So you were starting to talk about education. Are there elements of your education vision for the city that people should know about as you continue to outline your campaign platform?
Well, we need to start educating our school children, particularly those in low income minority neighborhoods. I mean, I think that it is just like the regulatory regime is one of the biggest drivers of inequality in the city. I think our public education system is one of the biggest perpetrators of racism in New York City. And when we talk about getting rid of the tests, for example, for the elite high schools, I think what we're really talking about is we're really saying, oh, gee, we can't possibly educate our Black and brown school children from K through 8 so that they are prepared for a test in 8th grade. And instead, we're blaming it on the fact that certain people can afford test prep and saying that that's the reason that the elite high schools are, dominated by Asians and to a slightly lesser extent whites. And I just don't, I don't buy that because, first of all, I have children and I
What
can tell you that no amount of test prep will solve for not learning cumulatively from kindergarten through 8th grade.
So how do you fix that? I mean, I don't think anybody would disagree with part of what you're saying. I think there's parts that are probably controversial, but part of what you're saying that for decades there have been underperforming, under-resourced schools, especially in communities of color in the city. How do you fix that? What's the there's people talking about trying to really scramble admissions processes to desegregate the city's schools to therefore spread resources around better. There's people who want more proliferation of charter schools. What are your solutions for this problem?
So, a couple of things. So, one is I don't think that people realize that when we offer the test for gifted and talented programs in kindergarten, that roughly 10,000 more students qualify for gifted and talented seats than we have available. So, what that tells me is not that we should get rid of gifted and talented programs, but that we should actually be expanding gifted and talented programs. And we should actually be raising standards of our curricula, not lowering standards. And I think that we have to rethink how we are incentivizing teachers and how much latitude, in charter schools, teachers and principals have a lot more latitude. In the regular public schools, they're kind of put in a box and and we say, okay, you have to operate in a box. And I read some study that said that something like 60% of New York City public school teachers are dissatisfied with their job. Well, that if you're dissatisfied with your job, how are if you're unhappy, right? How are you going to be a good teacher in the classroom in imparting wisdom and knowledge to your students, right? I just think we have to rethink a lot of things that we're doing in education. There is no magic bullet. That's the bottom line. There is no magic bullet, but there's lots of empirical data to point us in the right direction, and somebody has to have the political chutzpah to fight for that.
So unfortunately, we're getting into our last few minutes. I want to try to get to a couple other things. There's you're running in the Republican primary. That seems like it's going to be a competitive primary, though, with far fewer candidates than the Democratic primary.
Yes.
But even though in the not too distant past, the city has elected Republican mayors, it's now been 8 years. The city's voter enrollment registration keeps moving further towards a Democratic advantage. How do you, as a Republican, pitch to Republican primary voters, but then also the larger electorate, that they should go with a Republican, and explain what, how you would sort of characterize what kind of Republican you are?
So I would say that I am, first of all, I'm practical. I'm a problem solver. I'm not really an ideologue. I see the problems that are plaguing New York City. I don't think that you have to be a Republican or a Democrat, just a plain old New Yorker to see the problems that are afflicting our city. We obviously have a crime problem. We've got a public safety problem that we have to tackle. There's a clear inverse correlation between police presence and crime that we know. And so I think we need obviously a different mayor with different priorities and a different allocation of resources to the problems of public safety. We have to do it with again, a modicum of compassion and understanding that there is polarization between the community and the police, and deal with that with programs like, Build the Block program, NCO program, and we need to reinstitute an anti-crime unit, a crime deterrence unit in New York City, because obviously our problems are largely drugs, gangs, and guns. And we need to focus on that. And a lot of the crime is happening in the very low income minority neighborhoods that where the polarization is highest. So we have to think about that. And then back to I think everybody understands, both Republicans and Democrats, that we need some regulatory reform. I'm actually just shocked that the Democratic candidates aren't talking about it more.
Are you someone who's more in the sort of, I mean, he's bounced around his party affiliation, but are you sort of more of a Mike Bloomberg Republican, or are you more of a Donald Trump Republican? Did you support the president in the last couple of elections, the former president now?
I would say that I'm much more in the mold of a Mike Bloomberg Republican, in the sense that, again, I'm a practical problem solver, non-ideological candidate that believes that I believe that the default should be freedom, and I believe in what JFK said, that that a rising tide lifts all boats, and that in order to get to that place, we have to let the water in by reducing the regulatory dam that we've constructed.
And were you a Biden supporter, a Trump supporter, or neither, or somebody else?
I am a New Yorker. I am focused on the problems of New York City, and we have a mountain of problems in New York City, and I'm focused on the crisis in New York City.
Okay, interesting. All right, Sara Tirschwell is a Republican candidate for New York City mayor. Thanks for taking the time.
Thank you, Ben.
And thank you for watching Decision NYC with Ben Max. Key decisions for New York City voters are coming up in the June primaries and the fall general election. There's a lot on the line for all of us and the future of the city. I hope this conversation and others are helpful to you as you get ready to vote. Until next time, I'm Ben Max. Goodbye.